The gunshot shattered the evening calm of Mineral Point, Wyoming Territory, 1878. Matilda Armstrong ducked behind a water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild Mustang. She wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to be running from her husband's business associate, a man who had cornered her in her own home with intentions as dark as the bruises he'd left on her wrists. Mineral Point had once been her sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage. "Mrs. Armstrong!" the voice bellowed down the dusty main street. "Your husband's debt doesn't vanish with him in the ground." Matilda's trembling fingers clutched the small leather pouch containing every cent she had to her name. 3 weeks a widow, and already the vultures were circling. She'd known Thomas had gambling debts, but not that he'd used her as collateral. She peered over the edge of the trough. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and in the distance she could make out the silhouette of a rider approaching town. Distracted by the newcomer, her pursuer turned, giving Matilda the moment she needed. She gathered her skirts and ran for the alleyway between the general store and the saloon. The newcomer rode in slowly, his posture relaxed but alert. Even from a distance, Matilda could see the broad set of his shoulders beneath a dust-coated duster, the glint of the setting sun on his badge, a lawman. Then, in the purposeful way he guided his horse through town. From her hiding spot, Matilda watched as the stranger dismounted outside the sheriff's office. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that took in everything. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and knew precisely how to use it. "You the new marshal?" The voice belonged to Silas Weber, who owned the general store. "That I am." The stranger's voice was deep with a slight drawl. "Name's Hayes Young, federal marshal sent by the territorial governor." Matilda sank deeper into the shadows. A federal marshal would care little for her troubles. Such men were concerned with big crimes, not a woman running from her dead husband's debts. She would have to solve her own problems, as she always had. As darkness fell over Mineral Point, Matilda slipped away from town, heading for the old Miller cabin. Abandoned for years, it stood a mile outside town near the creek. She'd need shelter for the night, and tomorrow well. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out how to leave the only home she'd ever known. The cabin was as she remembered it. Small, run down, but with walls and a roof intact. Matilda pushed open the creaking door and jumped when something moved in the corner. "Don't shoot," came a woman's voice. "Please." Matilda squinted into the darkness. "I don't have a gun." A match flared, and by its light Matilda saw a young woman, perhaps 20, with a child sleeping beside her on a makeshift bed of burlap sacks. "I'm Sarah," the woman said. "This is my boy Joshua. We've nowhere else to go." Matilda introduced herself and learned that Sarah was fleeing an abusive husband in the next town over. 2 women in similar straits, seeking refuge in the same abandoned cabin. It might have been comical if it weren't so desperate. "They'll look for me come morning," Sarah whispered as they shared Matilda's small loaf of bread. "He has friends in Mineral Point." "Then we'll both have to be gone by dawn," Matilda replied. Neither woman slept much that night. At the first hint of daylight, they gathered their meager belongings. Sarah had a cousin in Laramie who might take them in, but it was a long journey on foot with a child. "Take this," Matilda said, pressing half her money into Sarah's palm. "It's not much, but it might buy you passage on a wagon train." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "I'll manage." Matilda managed a smile she didn't feel. "Always have." They parted ways at the creek, Sarah heading east toward the main road, Matilda striking north where the foothills offered hiding places. She'd heard there was work at the Henderson Ranch, 10 miles out. A woman could find employment cooking or cleaning, provided she was willing to endure the isolation and the rough company of cowhands. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and Matilda's water flask was nearly empty. Her feet, unused to such travel, had developed painful blisters in her impractical town shoes. Still, she pressed on, following the creek that would eventually lead to Henderson Land. She was crossing an open stretch when she heard hoofbeats. Instinctively, she dropped to the ground, hiding in the tall prairie grass. A lone rider approached, moving at a steady pace. As he drew closer, Matilda recognized the new marshal, Hayes Young. She remained motionless, barely breathing as he passed, but then he stopped, turning his horse in a slow circle, scanning the landscape with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent his life reading signs others missed. "I know you're there, madam," he called out. "No need to hide, I mean you no harm." Matilda weighed her options. Running would only draw attention. Reluctantly, she stood, brushing dirt from her skirt with as much dignity as she could muster. "Marshal Young," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady. "You're a long way from town." He studied her, taking in her disheveled appearance, the small bag clutched in her hand. "As are you, Mrs. Armstrong. Folks in town are concerned. Your house was broken into last night." "I wasn't there to be robbed, so I count myself fortunate," she replied. "Where are you headed?" "Henderson Ranch. I'm seeking employment." Marshal Young nodded slowly. "That's a fair piece to walk in this heat. I'm heading that direction myself. Would be no trouble to offer you a ride." Matilda hesitated. Accepting help from a man, any man, had rarely ended well for her, but her feet were blistered, her water gone, and the temperature rising. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "No burden." He extended a hand. "But we should move along. Storm brewing to the west." Matilda glanced at the horizon where dark clouds gathered. With reluctance born of experience, she accepted his hand and allowed him to pull her up behind him on the horse. She kept her hands lightly on his sides, determined to maintain as much distance as propriety allowed. They rode in silence for a time, the rhythmic movement of the horse lulling Matilda despite her wariness. When Marshal Young finally spoke, his voice startled her. "Those bruises on your wrists, they fresh?" Matilda instinctively tugged her sleeves down. "An unfortunate incident. With Everett Jenkins, I'm guessing." When she didn't respond, he continued. "He's been asking after you most insistently. Claims your husband owed him a considerable sum." "My husband owed many people," Matilda said stiffly. "I'm not responsible for his debts." "That's not how Jenkins sees it." Marshal Young paused. "He showed me a document. Your husband apparently wagered more than money." Matilda's stomach clenched. "Whatever document he has is a forgery. My husband was many things, but he wouldn't." Her voice broke. The truth was, she didn't know what Thomas would or wouldn't do. Their 5-year marriage had been a series of disappointments and broken promises. "I'm inclined to believe you," Marshal Young said. "Jenkins has a reputation." The sky darkened as they reached Henderson Land. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. The first fat raindrops began to fall as they approached the ranch house. "Marshal!" Henderson himself stood on the porch, a burly man with a thick gray beard. "Wasn't expecting you today." "Change of plans, John." Marshal Young dismounted, then helped Matilda down. "Mrs. Armstrong here is seeking employment. I told her you might have need of help with the house." Henderson looked Matilda over with a critical eye. "My wife handles the hiring for house matters. She's laid up with a bad ankle at present." "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Henderson," Matilda said, straightening her spine. "I can cook, clean, mend whatever's needed." Henderson seemed to consider this. "We've got a bunkhouse full of men with hearty appetites and not much in the way of manners. Cook left last month. It's not easy work for a lady." "I'm stronger than I look." The rain was coming harder now. Henderson nodded toward the house. "Better come inside before you're both soaked through. We can discuss it with the missus." The Henderson house was larger than Matilda had expected, with polished floors and actual wallpaper in the front parlor. Mrs. Henderson, a plump, pleasant-faced woman, sat with her bandaged foot propped on a stool. "Oh, you poor dear, you're drenched," she exclaimed when Matilda was shown in. "Martha, fetch a towel and some tea." A young maid hurried to comply, while Mrs. Henderson peppered Matilda with questions about her circumstances. Matilda provided a carefully edited version of events, mentioning her widowhood but not the circumstances of her hasty departure from town. "Well, we do need help with the cooking," Mrs. Henderson said when Matilda had finished. "The men have been making do with whatever Hank throws together, and they're a surly bunch because of it. Can you start tomorrow?" "I can start today," Matilda replied, "though I'll need some dry clothes." While the women discussed practical matters, Marshal Young and Henderson stepped onto the covered porch. Through the window, Matilda could see them engaged in serious conversation, with occasional glances back at the house. She wondered how much the marshal was revealing about her situation. Mrs. Henderson showed Matilda to a small room off the kitchen, the cook's quarters. "It's not fancy, but it's private," she said. "And you'll be close to the kitchen for those early morning starts. The men expect breakfast at sunrise." Matilda thanked her, grateful for the sanctuary, however temporary. After Mrs. Henderson left, she changed into the borrowed dress, a simple calico that hung a bit loose on her frame. She was combing her damp hair when there was a knock at the door. Marshal Young stood in the hallway, hat in hand. "I'll be heading back to town," he said. "Wanted to make sure you were settled." "I am, thank you." Matilda hesitated. "What did you tell Mr. Henderson?" "Only that you've had some trouble and could use honest work away from town for a spell." His eyes, a deep green she hadn't noticed before, held hers steadily. "I'll be looking into this business with Jenkins. If he's forging documents or threatening innocent women, he needs to answer for it." "Why would you help me?" Matilda asked, suspicion edging her voice. In her experience, men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. Marshal Young seemed to understand her wariness. "It's my job to uphold the law, Mrs. Armstrong. That includes protecting those who can't protect themselves." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll return in a few days to check on you. If Jenkins or anyone else comes around asking questions, Henderson knows to send them on their way." With that, he tipped his hat and left. Matilda watched through the window as he mounted his horse and rode out into the rain. She couldn't decide if his presence made her feel more or less secure. The kitchen proved to be Matilda's salvation. While Mrs. Henderson managed the household staff, a maid, a laundress, and 2 general helpers, Matilda had complete autonomy over meals. The work was hard, starting before dawn, and often not finishing until after dark, but it was honest and straightforward. No one asked questions about her past, and the Cowboys were appreciative of her cooking, showing their gratitude with polite manners at the table and the occasional gift of wildflowers or a particularly nice piece of wood for her fire. A week passed without incident. Matilda settled into a routine, finding unexpected peace in the rhythm of ranch life. Each day brought its own challenges: a temperamental stove, dwindling supplies, weather that affected what she could prepare, but she met each one with growing confidence. On her 8th day at the ranch, Matilda was kneading dough for the evening bread when she heard a commotion outside. Looking through the kitchen window, she saw a group of riders approaching. Her heart stuttered when she recognized Everett Jenkins among them. "Mrs. Henderson," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "There are visitors." Mrs. Henderson peered out the window and frowned. "I don't recognize them. John's not back from the north pasture yet." She turned to Matilda. "Would you ask Martha to fetch my husband's shotgun from the study? I believe we should be prepared for uninvited guests." Matilda relayed the message, then returned to the window. Jenkins and 3 other men had dismounted and were approaching the house. Their manner was casual, but Matilda recognized the predatory set of Jenkins's shoulders. Mrs. Henderson positioned herself on the front porch, the shotgun across her lap. "May I help you, gentlemen?" she called as they approached. Jenkins removed his hat with a flourish that struck Matilda as theatrical. "Madam, we're looking for a woman who ran off from Mineral Point, widow by the name of Armstrong. She's wanted for theft." "Theft?" Mrs. Henderson's voice betrayed no emotion. "That's a serious accusation." "Indeed it is. She stole from me directly." Jenkins put on a sorrowful expression. "I was a business partner of her late husband. After his passing, I tried to help the poor woman, even offered her a position in my household. She repaid my kindness by taking valuable items and fleeing in the night." From her vantage point inside, Matilda's hands curled into fists, the audacity of the man's lies. "I see," Mrs. Henderson said slowly. "And what proof do you have of these allegations?" Jenkins's smile tightened. "I don't believe I need to provide proof to a civilian, madam, if you could simply tell us if you've seen her. Actually, you do need proof." The new voice came from behind the men. Marshal Young sat atop his horse, his expression impassive, especially when making accusations against a respectable widow. Jenkins turned, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he recognized the badge. Marshal Young. I didn't realize you were in these parts. Evidently, Marshal Young dismounted, tying his horse to the porch rail. Mrs. Henderson, I apologize for the intrusion. I was on my way to speak with you and your husband when I encountered these gentlemen. No apology necessary, Marshal. I was just explaining to these men that I run a respectable house and don't appreciate unfounded accusations. Marshal Young nodded. Perhaps you gentlemen would like to continue this conversation in town, where we can involve the proper legal channels. Jenkins's expression darkened. This is a private matter, Marshal. The woman owes me. So you've said, yet I've found no record of any legitimate debt. What I have found, Marshal Young continued, his voice hardening, are several complaints against you for intimidation and fraud in neighboring counties. A tense silence followed. Jenkins's companions exchanged uneasy glances. You're making a mistake, Marshal, Jenkins finally said. She's nothing but a barren widow with no family or connections, hardly worth your trouble. Matilda flinched at the cruel words, a familiar pain lancing through her. It had been Thomas's favorite insult in their last years together, worthless, barren, a failure as a wife. The wound was still raw. That's where you're wrong, Marshal Young replied, his voice deadly quiet. Every citizen under my protection is worth my trouble. Now, I suggest you gentlemen leave Henderson property before I arrest you for trespassing. For a moment, Matilda thought Jenkins might challenge the marshal. His hand hovered near his gun, and his eyes held a dangerous gleam. But after a tense standoff, he backed down, motioning to his companions. This isn't over, he said as he mounted his horse. For your sake, it should be, Marshal Young replied. If I see you bothering Mrs. Armstrong again, you'll answer for it before a judge. Matilda watched from the window as the men rode away. Jenkins casting one last venomous look at the house before they disappeared down the road. Only when they were out of sight did she realize she'd been holding her breath. Mrs. Henderson came inside, the shotgun still clutched in her hands. Are you all right, dear? That man seemed particularly vile. I'm fine, Matilda lied. Thank you for not telling them I was here. Nonsense, I know trouble when I see it, and that man is trouble. Mrs. Henderson set the shotgun aside. Besides, you've been a godsend in the kitchen. The men haven't eaten this well in months. Marshal Young entered, removing his hat. His eyes immediately found Matilda, assessing her with a glance that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. They won't give up so easily, he said. Jenkins isn't the type to let go of what he considers his. I'm not his, Matilda said, anger flaring through her fear. I never was. Whatever arrangement he claims to have had with my husband died with Thomas. I know that, Marshal Young replied gently. But Jenkins believes otherwise, and that makes him dangerous. Mrs. Henderson looked between them. Perhaps I should give you two a moment to discuss this privately. I need to speak with Martha about dinner arrangements anyway. She patted Matilda's arm as she passed. Don't worry, dear, you have friends here. When they were alone, Marshal Young stepped closer. I've been investigating Jenkins. He's involved in more than just gambling. There are rumors he's been forcing women into compromising situations to pay off their husbands' debts. Matilda shuddered, remembering the way Jenkins had looked at her at Thomas's funeral, how his fingers had lingered too long on her arm as he offered his condolences. What can I do? She asked. I can't stay here and put the Hendersons at risk. Running isn't the answer, Marshal Young said. That's exactly what he expects. He'll keep hunting you and eventually he'll catch up. Then what do you suggest? Matilda couldn't keep the frustration from her voice. I have no money, no family, no protection beyond your badge, and you can't always be around. No, he agreed. But I can make sure Jenkins faces consequences for his actions. I've sent telegrams to marshals in the territories where complaints have been filed. If we can build a case against him. That takes time, Matilda interrupted. Time I may not have. Marshal Young studied her, his expression thoughtful. There's another option, though it's not ideal. I have a small homestead about 5 miles from town. It's isolated, hard to find unless you know where to look. You could stay there while I gather evidence against Jenkins." Matilda stared at him, suspicious of his motives. "Why would you offer your home to a stranger?" "Because no one should have to live in fear," he replied simply. "And because I've seen too many people like Jenkins get away with preying on those they perceive as weak." There was something in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, perhaps, that made Matilda believe him. Still, she hesitated. "I have a position here. Mrs. Henderson has been kind. And she would understand. Her own sister was in a similar situation years ago." He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "Mrs. Armstrong, Matilda Jenkins isn't just after money. The way he spoke about you, I've seen that look before. He won't stop until he has what he wants." The blunt assessment sent a chill down Matilda's spine. She knew he was right. She'd recognized that predatory gleam in Jenkins's eyes. "When would we leave?" she asked quietly. "Tonight, after dark. Pack only what you can carry. We'll tell the Hendersons you're visiting a sick relative." Matilda nodded slowly. "I should finish the bread for dinner and prepare something for tomorrow's breakfast." "Of course." Marshal Young replaced his hat. "I'll speak with Henderson when he returns. Be ready to leave at midnight." After he left, Matilda returned to her bread dough, kneading with renewed vigor as if she could pound away her fear and uncertainty. The familiar task calmed her racing thoughts, allowing her to consider her options. She could refuse the marshal's offer, stay at the ranch, and hope Jenkins didn't return with more men. She could try running again, perhaps to one of the larger towns where she might lose herself among more people. Or she could trust Marshal Young, a man she barely knew, but who had already proven himself willing to stand between her and danger. When John Henderson returned from the pastures, he came to the kitchen immediately. His weathered face was solemn as he explained that the marshal had told him everything. "My wife and I want you to know you're welcome to stay here," he said. "But the marshal's right, our place is too exposed, too well known. His cabin would be safer for now." "You trust him that much?" Matilda asked. Henderson nodded. "Known Hayes Young for going on 5 years now. He's a good man. Doesn't say much about his past, but I know he came west after the war with ghosts on his heels. Whatever demons he's fighting, they've made him determined to protect those who can't protect themselves." He hesitated. "Especially women in your situation." "My situation? Alone, vulnerable." Henderson cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation. "The marshal's sister was, well, she suffered at the hands of a man like Jenkins. Young couldn't save her, but he's been trying to make up for it ever since." The revelation cast Marshal Young's involvement in a new light. Was he helping her out of genuine concern, or was she merely a stand-in for the sister he couldn't protect? Either way, his cabin seemed the safest option available. At midnight, Matilda slipped out the back door of the Henderson house, a small bundle of belongings under her arm. Marshal Young waited with 2 horses in the shadow of the barn. "Mrs. Henderson packed some food," Matilda whispered, holding up a cloth-wrapped package. "Good. It's a few hours' ride." He helped her mount, his hands respectful and impersonal. "We'll take the long way, just in case anyone's watching the main road." They rode in silence through the moonlit prairie, following game trails and creek beds that would leave minimal tracks. Matilda had never been on a horse for so long, and despite Marshal Young's occasional concerned glances, she refused to complain about her discomfort. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached a small valley nestled between rocky outcroppings. A cabin stood in a grove of cottonwoods, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. A creek burbled nearby, and a small corral housed a few chickens and a milk cow. "It's not much," Marshal Young said as he helped her dismount, "but it's secure." Matilda's legs nearly buckled when she touched the ground, muscles protesting after the long ride. The marshal caught her elbow, steadying her with a strong hand. "Sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "No need to apologize. That was a difficult journey, especially for someone not used to riding." His voice held no judgment. "Let's get you inside. You can rest while I tend to the horses." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. One large room served as kitchen, dining, and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A door led to what Matilda presumed was a bedroom. Everything was neat and functional, with a few unexpected touches: a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, a colorful quilt draped over a rocking chair, a collection of carved wooden animals on the mantel. "The bedroom is yours," Marshal Young said when he returned. "I'll sleep out here." "I can't take your bed," Matilda protested. "You can and will." His tone brooked no argument. "I'm rarely here anyway. Most nights I stay in town or on the trail." He built a fire and heated water while Matilda explored the cabin. The bedroom was as tidy as the main room, with a sturdy bed, a chest for clothing, and a small table with a basin for washing. A window overlooked the creek, letting in the morning light. When she returned to the main room, Marshal Young had prepared coffee and was slicing bread from the package Mrs. Henderson had sent. "You should eat something, then rest," he said, gesturing to a chair at the table. "I need to return to town before my absence is noticed. Jenkins will be watching for signs of where you've gone." Matilda sat, accepting the coffee with gratitude. "How long do you think I'll need to stay here?" "Hard to say. A week, maybe 2. I've sent telegrams to Denver and Cheyenne about Jenkins. With luck, they'll respond soon with enough evidence to arrest him." "And if they don't?" Marshal Young's expression hardened. "Then I'll find another way to ensure your safety." They ate in silence, the events of the night catching up with Matilda as exhaustion set in. Marshal Young seemed to notice her flagging energy. "There's a shotgun by the door and a revolver in the drawer by the bed," he said. "Do you know how to use them?" "My father taught me to shoot when I was young," Matilda replied, "though it's been many years." "Good. I doubt anyone will find this place, but better to be prepared." He rose, clearing their plates. "I'll try to return by nightfall tomorrow. There are supplies in the root cellar and flour in the bin beside the stove if you want to bake." Matilda nodded, touched by his thoughtfulness in mentioning the baking supplies. He'd noticed then how at peace she seemed in the kitchen. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this." Marshal Young paused at the door, his eyes meeting hers. "You're welcome, Mrs. Armstrong." After he left, Matilda moved to the bedroom and collapsed on the bed, too tired even to remove her shoes. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in weeks. She awoke late in the afternoon, disoriented until she remembered where she was. The cabin was quiet except for the cheerful crackling of the fire Marshal Young had banked before leaving. Matilda washed her face in the basin, combed her hair, and changed into her spare dress, feeling refreshed despite the circumstances. Exploring the cabin more thoroughly, she found evidence of a solitary but orderly life. The marshal's possessions were few but well maintained. Books on law and history shared shelf space with adventure novels and a worn Bible. In a trunk near the fireplace, she discovered carefully folded quilts and a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, addressed to "My dear brother Hayes" in a delicate feminine hand. Feeling like an intruder, Matilda quickly replaced the letters. Instead, she focused on practical matters, taking inventory of the kitchen supplies and planning what she might prepare for the marshal's return. Cooking had always soothed her, giving her a sense of control even when the rest of her life was in chaos. By the time darkness fell, Matilda had cleaned the cabin, fed the chickens and cow, and prepared a simple stew from the supplies in the root cellar. She set the table for 2, then sat in the rocking chair with one of the marshal's books, listening for the sound of hoof beats. When midnight came with no sign of Marshal Young, she banked the fire and reluctantly retired to the bedroom, the revolver from the drawer placed carefully on the bedside table. Sleep eluded her as she strained to hear any approaching riders, her mind conjuring scenarios of Jenkins discovering her hiding place or the marshal meeting with foul play on his return journey. Dawn broke with still no sign of her protector. Matilda rose, washed, and made coffee, trying to quell her growing anxiety. She was tending to the animals when she finally heard a horse approaching. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by caution. She retreated to the cabin, grabbing the shotgun from beside the door. Her tension eased when she recognized Marshal Young's tall figure, but as he drew closer, she saw he was slumped in the saddle, one arm held stiffly against his side. His face was drawn with pain. "Marshal!" Matilda set the shotgun aside and rushed to help as he dismounted awkwardly. "Just a disagreement with a gentleman in town," he said through gritted teeth. "Nothing serious." But the dark stains spreading across his shirt told a different story. Matilda helped him inside, easing him into a chair. "Let me see," she insisted, already reaching for his shirt buttons. "It's not proper," he began, but she cut him off. "Propriety won't stop you from bleeding to death, Marshal Young." He relented, allowing her to help remove his shirt. A deep gash ran along his ribs, still seeping blood. Matilda bit her lip at the sight of the wound. "Who did this?" she asked as she gathered clean cloths and water. "One of Jenkins' men," he admitted. "Caught me leaving the telegraph office, said it was a message to mind my own business." Matilda's hands stilled. "This is because of me." "No." His voice was firm despite his pain. "This is because men like Jenkins believe they're above the law. I've been investigating him since before you arrived in town." As gently as possible, Matilda cleaned the wound. It was deep but clean, a knife slash rather than a bullet hole. "This needs stitching," she said. Marshal Young nodded toward a cabinet. "Medical kit on the top shelf. I keep it stocked." Matilda retrieved the kit, relieved to find catgut sutures and a curved needle among the supplies. "I've done this before," she said, seeing his questioning look. "My father was often injured in his work. My mother taught me." "What was his work?" Marshal Young asked, clearly trying to distract himself as she threaded the needle. "He built houses," Matilda replied, focusing on her task. "Not always carefully. Hold still, this will hurt." To his credit, the marshal barely flinched as she stitched the wound, his jaw tight with controlled pain. Matilda worked quickly but meticulously, drawing the edges of the gash together with neat sutures. "You have a steady hand," he observed when she finished. "Useful for more than just cooking," she said with a small smile, wrapping clean bandages around his torso. Her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and surprisingly soft over hard muscle. "The stew smells good," he said, nodding toward the pot simmering on the stove. "I could eat." Matilda helped him into a clean shirt from his bedroom, then served the reheated stew. As they ate, Marshal Young explained what he'd learned in town. "Jenkins has been gathering men, offering bounties for information about your whereabouts. He's desperate to find you before the telegrams I sent bring the law down on him." He paused, meeting her eyes across the table. "I won't lie to you, Matilda. He's dangerous, and growing more so. But I've received word from Denver. They're sending a U.S. Marshal and deputies with warrants for Jenkins's arrest on multiple counts of fraud, extortion, and assault." "How long until they arrive?" 3 days, perhaps 4. He grimaced as he shifted in his chair. "My deputy will keep an eye on Jenkins's movements until then. You should be safe here." "And you?" Matilda asked. "That wound needs rest to heal properly." Marshal Young's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Are you suggesting I stay, Mrs. Armstrong?" Matilda felt heat rise in her cheeks. "For your recovery, of course. It would be irresponsible to travel with such an injury." "Of course," he agreed, though something in his eyes, a warmth. A spark of humor suggested he saw through her practical explanation. "If you're comfortable with the arrangement." "I am," she said simply. "You've risked your life to protect me. The least I can do is ensure you don't tear those stitches riding back to town." So began an unexpected period of domesticity in the isolated cabin. Marshal Young, who insisted she call him Hayes, given the circumstances, proved to be a considerate housemate despite his injury. He kept to the main room as promised, sleeping on a pallet near the fire, and was scrupulously respectful of her privacy. During the days when his pain allowed, Hayes would sit on the porch and whittle or read while Matilda tended the garden or baked in the kitchen. They fell into comfortable conversations about books they'd read, places they'd seen, and the changing seasons in Wyoming territory. Hayes spoke little of his past beyond mentioning his service in the war and his decision to become a lawman afterward. Matilda, in turn, shared carefully edited stories of her childhood in Missouri and her move west with Thomas after their marriage. "How did you meet your husband?" Hayes asked on the third day as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Matilda sighed, the memories both sweet and bitter. "I was 18, working in my father's general store. Thomas came in to buy supplies. He was handsome, charming, full of stories about opportunities in the West." She smiled ruefully. "I was young and romantic enough to believe them all." "You loved him?" "I did at first." Matilda traced a pattern on the arm of her chair. "He was kind in the beginning. It changed gradually. A harsh word here, a disapproving look there. By our 3rd year of marriage, I dreaded his moods." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically, no, but words can leave their own kind of bruises." She hadn't meant to say so much, but something about the twilight and Hayes's steady presence made it easier to speak of painful things. "We'd been trying for a child since our wedding night. When none came, he blamed me, called me barren, worthless, said no real woman would fail at such a simple task." The memory still stung, and Matilda blinked back unexpected tears. "I started to believe him. What good is a wife who can't give her husband children?" "Plenty of good," Hayes said firmly. "A woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to bear children." Matilda gave him a skeptical look. "That's not how most men see it." "I'm not most men." His voice was quiet but intense. "My sister Rebecca was told the same by her husband, that she was worthless because she couldn't give him sons. He made her life a misery because of it, broke her spirit piece by piece." His hands gripped the arms of his chair. "By the time I returned from the war and found out what was happening, it was too late. She took her own life rather than endure another day of his cruelty." "I'm so sorry," Matilda whispered, understanding now the shadow she sometimes saw in his eyes. Hayes nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "After Becky died, I swore I'd never stand by while someone suffered that kind of abuse. That's why I became a marshal. That's why I couldn't ignore what was happening with Jenkins." In that moment, Matilda saw Hayes, not just the badge or the protection he offered, but the man himself, shaped by loss and driven by a deep sense of justice. It shifted something in her perception, made him suddenly more than just a lawman doing his duty. The next morning, Matilda was kneading dough for bread when Hayes entered the kitchen, moving more freely than he had since his injury. "The wound's healing well," he said in response to her questioning look. "Your stitching would put most doctors to shame." "Another useful skill for a frontier wife," she replied with a small smile. Though Thomas never appreciated such practical talents. He wanted a more decorative spouse, I think. "His loss," Hayes said simply. He watched her work for a moment, the strong, rhythmic movement of her hands in the dough. "My deputy is riding out today to give us an update. Should arrive by midday." Matilda nodded, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety his words provoked. Once the other marshals arrived from Denver, Hayes would return to his duties in town. This interlude, this strange, peaceful time in the isolated cabin, would end. She would need to decide what came next. "What will you do?" Hayes asked, as if reading her thoughts. "After Jenkins is dealt with, I mean." Matilda shaped the dough into loaves, buying time as she considered the question. "I'm not sure. I could return to the Henderson Ranch, I suppose, or perhaps try one of the larger towns where there might be more opportunities for a woman on her own." "You could stay in Mineral Point," Hayes suggested. "Your house is still there." "It never felt like home," Matilda admitted. "Just a place where I lived with a man who grew to resent me." Hayes moved closer, leaning against the table where she worked. "What would feel like home to you, Matilda?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked what she wanted in so long. "Somewhere safe," she said slowly. "Somewhere I could be useful, respected for my work. Somewhere I could plant flowers and know I'd be there to see them bloom." Hayes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds reasonable enough." "Does it?" Matilda laughed softly, setting the loaves aside to rise. "Most would say a woman alone has few prospects beyond remarriage or taking in laundry." "You're more than capable of making your own way," Hayes said. "I've seen that clearly these past days." His confidence in her abilities warmed something long cold inside Matilda. Before she could respond, however, they heard the approach of a horse. Hayes moved to the window, his hand automatically going to the gun at his hip. "It's Ben," he said with relief, recognizing his deputy. The news Ben brought was both good and troubling. The marshals from Denver would arrive the following day, but Jenkins had grown increasingly erratic, drinking heavily and making wild threats against Hayes and Matilda. "He's losing control," Ben said, accepting the coffee Matilda offered. "Scared, I reckon, now that his past is catching up to him. Makes him unpredictable." "Has he made any moves to leave town?" Hayes asked. "Not yet, but he's gathered a half-dozen rough types around him. They're staying close, watching the roads." Ben glanced at Matilda. "No sign they know about this place, though." The deputy left before sundown, promising to return with the Denver marshals the next day. As darkness fell, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing wind and driving rain that rattled the cabin windows. Matilda and Hayes sat before the fire, the howling storm making their shelter seem even more isolated. The tension of waiting had worn on them both, and they spoke little, lost in their own thoughts. "I should check on the animals," Hayes said finally, rising from his chair. "In this weather?" Matilda looked up in concern. "Your wound is healing well, thanks to your care," he finished. "The barn isn't far and the chickens and cow need tending." Matilda rose as well. "I'll come with you. 2 sets of hands will make it quicker." Hayes looked ready to argue but nodded instead. "Bundle up. The wind is fierce." They wrapped themselves in oilcloth coats and ventured into the storm. The short distance to the barn felt much longer as they battled the wind and rain. Once inside, the relative quiet was a relief. The cow lowed softly in greeting, and the chickens clucked from their roosts. They worked in companionable silence, Hayes milking the cow while Matilda collected eggs and refreshed the chickens' water. It was a domestic scene, ordinary and yet somehow precious in its simplicity. "We make a good team," Hayes observed as they finished the chores. Matilda smiled, tucking the eggs safely in a basket. "Yes, I suppose we do." Their eyes met across the dimly lit barn, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how naturally they had fallen into this shared rhythm. Hayes took a step toward her, then stopped as a sound caught his attention. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice suddenly alert. Matilda listened but heard only the storm. "Just the wind." Hayes held up a hand, silencing her. He moved to the barn door, easing it open a fraction to peer out into the rain-soaked darkness. His body tensed. "Riders," he whispered. 5, maybe 6. Fear clutched at Matilda's heart. "Jenkins?" "Likely." Hayes closed the door quietly and turned to her. "They're approaching from the east. Must have followed Ben's tracks." "What do we do?" Matilda asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Hayes was already moving, checking his gun. "Get to the cabin. There's a trap door under the rug by the fireplace, a root cellar. Hide there." "What about you?" "I'll lead them away from the cabin." "Make them think you've already gone." Matilda shook her head. "No, I won't let you face them alone." "Matilda, I can shoot, remember?" She squared her shoulders. "And I'm tired of running, tired of others fighting my battles." Hayes studied her face, seeing the determination there. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this smart. We need to get to the cabin before they surround it." They slipped out of the barn, keeping to the shadows as they made their way back to the cabin. The storm provided cover, the rain masking their movements as they hurried through the darkness. They were halfway to the door when a shout rang out. "There! By the house!" A bullet splintered wood near Matilda's head. Hayes pulled her down behind a rain barrel, his body shielding hers as more shots followed. "When I say run, get to the door," he murmured in her ear. "I'll cover you." Matilda nodded, her heart pounding. Hayes fired 2 shots toward their attackers, then pushed her forward. "Run!" She sprinted for the cabin, expecting at any moment to feel the burn of a bullet. Behind her, Hayes kept firing, forcing Jenkins's men to take cover. Matilda reached the door and flung it open, turning to see Hayes backing toward her, still exchanging fire with the shadowy figures approaching through the rain. Once inside, Hayes barricaded the door while Matilda grabbed the shotgun and extra ammunition. They moved quickly, extinguishing lamps and taking positions at windows. "How much ammunition do we have?" Matilda asked, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Enough to hold them off until morning," Hayes replied. "By then, the Denver marshals should be close," a voice called from outside, barely audible above the storm. "Marshal Young, send out the woman and we'll let you live." "Jenkins," Hayes muttered, charming as ever. "I know she's in there, Marshal," Jenkins shouted. "A barren widow ain't worth dying for." The cruel words struck Matilda like physical blows. She flinched, the old hurt resurging despite herself. Hayes noticed her reaction and moved to her side. "Don't listen to him," he said quietly. "Remember what I told you." Matilda nodded, forcing herself to focus. "What's our plan?" "Keep them at bay until help arrives. They'll try to rush the cabin eventually. When they do, aim for the legs if you can. I'd rather take them alive to stand trial." Jenkins' men made several attempts to approach the cabin, but the combination of the storm and the defenders' accurate fire kept them at bay. Hours passed in a tense standoff, with occasional exchanges of gunfire, but no coordinated attack. As dawn approached, the storm began to ease. Matilda, exhausted but alert, kept watch at a side window while Hayes monitored the front. "They're getting restless," he observed. "Jenkins is losing control of them." Through her window, Matilda could see two men arguing with Jenkins, gesturing angrily toward the cabin. Jenkins appeared to be drinking from a flask, his movements becoming more agitated. "He's drunk," she said, "and desperate. A dangerous combination." Hayes checked his ammunition. "The light's improving. If they're going to make a move, it will be soon." As if in response to his words, Jenkins bellowed orders and his men spread out, preparing to rush the cabin from multiple directions. "Here they come," Hayes warned. "Remember, aim low if you can." The attack came in a disorganized wave, the men charging through the muddy yard toward the cabin. Matilda fired at a man approaching her window, striking him in the leg. He fell with a cry, crawling back toward the cover of the trees. Hayes's shots were equally effective, dropping two more attackers before they reached the porch. But Jenkins and one remaining man made it to the front door, throwing their weight against the barricade. The wooden bar across the door groaned under their assault. "Matilda, get back," Hayes called, moving to reinforce the door. The window beside Matilda shattered as Jenkins's companion fired through it. She ducked, glass raining around her. When she looked up, the man was climbing through the broken window. Without hesitation, Matilda swung the shotgun, striking him in the face with the butt. He stumbled back, and she followed with a shot that caught him in the shoulder, knocking him back outside. The door splintered, and Jenkins burst through, wild-eyed and furious. Hayes grappled with him, the two men crashing into the table. Jenkins was smaller, but fueled by whiskey and desperation. He landed a blow to Hayes's injured side, causing him to gasp in pain. Matilda aimed the shotgun, but the men were too entangled for a clear shot. She searched frantically for an opening as they fought, furniture splintering around them. Jenkins pulled a knife, the blade glinting in the gray dawn light. "Should have minded your own business, Marshal," he snarled, slashing at Hayes. Hayes caught Jenkins' wrist, straining to keep the blade away from his throat, but his wounded side hampered him, and Jenkins was slowly gaining the advantage. Matilda set aside the shotgun and grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace. With all her strength, she brought it down on Jenkins's arm. Bone cracked and he screamed, the knife clattering to the floor. Hayes seized the opportunity, landing a solid punch that knocked Jenkins unconscious. He slumped to the floor, his face bloody. For a moment, the cabin was silent except for their ragged breathing. Hayes looked up at Matilda, still gripping the poker. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, suddenly trembling as the fear and tension released their hold. "You're bleeding again," she said, noticing the spreading stain on his shirt. "Worth it," Hayes replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were magnificent." Before Matilda could respond, they heard the sound of multiple riders approaching. Hayes moved cautiously to the window. "U.S. Marshals," he said with relief. "Right on time." The aftermath was a blur of activity. The Denver marshals took Jenkins and his surviving men into custody. A doctor was summoned from town to treat the wounded, including Hayes, whose stitches had indeed torn in the fight. Matilda moved through it all in a daze, answering questions and providing coffee for the lawmen who filled the small cabin. It was only when the prisoners had been taken away and the doctor had rebandaged Hayes's wound that the reality of what had happened, what could have happened, truly hit her. She found a quiet corner of the porch and sat, watching as the marshals prepared to leave. Hayes was speaking with their leader, nodding at whatever the man was saying. His face was bruised, his posture revealing his fatigue, but there was something undeniably powerful about him, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with physical prowess and everything to do with the kind of man he was. When the others had gone, Hayes joined her on the porch. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the sun broke fully through the clouds, turning the rain-washed landscape to gold. "Jenkins will face trial in Denver," Hayes finally said. "Along with charges from his other victims, he'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison." "Good," Matilda said simply. Hayes turned to her, his expression serious. "You saved my life in there." "You've been saving mine since we met," she replied. It seemed only fair to return the favor. A smile tugged at his mouth. "Is that what we're doing? Keeping score?" "I hope not," Matilda said softly. "I'd rather not think of it as a debt to be repaid." "What would you call it then?" Matilda considered the question, looking out at the land that had witnessed their ordeal. Friendship, perhaps, or something else entirely. Hayes shifted in his chair to face her more directly. "Before all this happened, you were telling me what home would mean to you. Somewhere safe, you said, somewhere you could be useful and respected." Matilda nodded, remembering the conversation that seemed to have taken place in another lifetime. "I've been thinking about that," Hayes continued. "This place, my cabin, it's too small for my plans. I've purchased land closer to town. 100 acres with good water and timber. I've started building a proper house there." "That sounds wonderful," Matilda said, unsure where the conversation was leading. "It could be," Hayes agreed, "with the right person sharing it." Matilda's heart skipped. "Hayes, let me finish, please." He took a deep breath. "I'm not a man of fancy words, Matilda, but these past days, watching you in my home, seeing your courage and strength, it's made me realize what's been missing in my life." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I know it's sudden. I know you've had more than enough of men making decisions for you. So I'm not asking for promises, just a chance." Matilda looked at their joined hands, then up at Hayes's face, open, honest, hopeful. "A chance for what?" "For us to discover if what I feel for you, what I hope you might feel for me, could grow into something lasting." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "You could stay in town, establish yourself independently. We could court properly, take our time getting to know each other." "And if it doesn't work out?" Matilda asked, practical despite the warmth spreading through her at his touch. "Then you'll have a friend for life, and my support in whatever path you choose." His eyes held hers steadily. "But I believe it will work, Matilda. I believe we could build something rare together." Matilda considered his words, weighing them against her fears and hopes. She thought of Thomas, of the dreams that had withered in that marriage, but she thought too of the past days with Hayes, his respect for her abilities, his unwavering belief in her worth, the easy companionship they'd found. "I've been told I'm worthless for being barren," she whispered, voicing the fear that still haunted her. "What if you want children someday?" Hayes's expression softened. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You're priceless to me," he said simply. "Children or no children. It's you I want to share my life with, Matilda. Just you." The sincerity in his voice, in his eyes, melted the last of Matilda's resistance. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I'd like that chance, Hayes. Very much." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a passion. When they drew apart, Hayes smiled, the shadows in his eyes replaced by something brighter. "So," he said, "shall we begin?" Spring turned to summer, and Mineral Point buzzed with gossip about the courtship between Marshal Young and the widow Armstrong. They made an odd couple to some eyes, the serious lawman and the quiet woman who had taken over management of the hotel's restaurant. But those who knew them best saw the rightness in their pairing. Hayes called on Matilda formally 3 evenings a week, taking her for walks or to church socials. On Sundays, he escorted her to services, enduring the knowing smiles of the townsfolk with good humor. Sometimes they rode out to his land, where the new house was slowly taking shape. Matilda offered suggestions for the layout of rooms and the placement of windows to catch the best light, and Hayes incorporated each one into his plans. In August, when the house was finally complete, Hayes proposed properly, with a ring that had belonged to his mother and a speech he'd clearly rehearsed but delivered with heartfelt sincerity. Matilda accepted without hesitation, the doubts of the early days long since resolved. They were married in September, a simple ceremony attended by the Hendersons, Hayes's deputy Ben, and a few friends from town. Mrs. Henderson wept openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their new home watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Hayes wrapped his arms around Matilda from behind. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Completely," she replied, leaning back against him. "Though there's still so much to do. Curtains to hang, furniture to arrange, and a garden to plant," Hayes added, knowing how she'd longed for one. "I cleared that patch by the south wall, just as you wanted." Matilda turned in his arms, touched by his thoughtfulness. "You remembered?" "Of course I did." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You said you wanted to plant flowers and know you'd be there to see them bloom. I want you to have that, Matilda. I want you to have everything that brings you joy." "I already do," she said simply, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. Later, as they lay in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Matilda traced the scar on Hayes's side, a permanent reminder of how their story began. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if things would have been different if Jenkins hadn't come after me? If we hadn't spent those days in your cabin?" Hayes considered the question, his fingers playing with her hair spread across the pillow. "I'd have found you anyway," he said finally. "Some things are meant to be, despite the paths we take to get there." Matilda smiled at his unexpected romanticism. "I never thought I'd find this," she admitted. "After Thomas, after everything. I thought that part of life was over for me." "I know." Hayes gathered her closer. "I felt the same after Rebecca died. Like I'd failed at the one thing that mattered, and all I could do was try to make amends by helping others." His voice softened. "But then I found you, or you found me, and suddenly there was more to life than just duty." They built their life together season by season, year by year. Hayes continued his work as marshal, though he delegated more to his deputies as time passed. Matilda's garden flourished, as did her reputation as one of the finest cooks in the territory. She began teaching cooking classes to young women in town, finding unexpected fulfillment in passing on her skills. In their second year of marriage, they took in a young orphan boy, Jacob, whose parents had died on the trail west. He was 12, wild as a Mustang and twice as stubborn, but under Hayes's patient guidance and Matilda's nurturing care, he thrived. By the time he was 16, he was calling them Ma and Pa without self-consciousness. When Jacob was 17, he announced his intention to follow in Hayes's footsteps and become a lawman. Hayes tried to talk him out of it, knowing the dangers, but Matilda intervened. "Let him find his own path," she counseled her husband, "just as we found ours." The year Jacob left for training in Denver, a wagon train passed through Mineral Point. Among the travelers was a young woman with her infant sister. Their parents had died of fever on the journey, and the young woman, barely 18 herself, was determined to reach Oregon, where distant relatives awaited. Matilda felt an immediate connection to the girl, whose quiet dignity reminded her of herself at that age. When the baby fell ill and the wagon train couldn't delay, Hayes and Matilda offered to care for the children until they recovered. Days turned to weeks, and the young woman, Sarah, found work in town. The baby, Emma, grew stronger under Matilda's care. When it came time for them to continue their journey, Sarah hesitated. "You've made a home here," she observed one evening as they sat on the porch, Emma sleeping in Matilda's arms. "I never thought that was possible for women like us alone, without family." "It is possible," Matilda assured her, "though sometimes the family you find isn't the one you were born to." Sarah stayed, finding purpose working alongside Matilda in her cooking classes, eventually opening a small bakery of her own. Emma grew from infant to toddler to little girl, calling Hayes Grandpa and Matilda Grandma with natural ease. 5 years after Jacob left, he returned to Mineral Point with a badge of his own and a young woman he introduced as his fiancée. The house that Hayes had built filled with laughter and conversation as their unconventional family gathered to celebrate. That night, after everyone else had retired, Hayes found Matilda sitting on the porch swing, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, sitting beside her. Matilda smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "I was just thinking about that night at your cabin when Jenkins called me worthless for being barren." Hayes's arm tightened around her. He was wrong. "Yes," Matilda agreed, "so very wrong. Look at our family, Hayes. Jacob, Sarah, little Emma. We may not have created them, but they're ours all the same." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And they're here because of you, because you saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself." "We built this together," Hayes corrected gently, "and it's more than I ever dreamed possible." As they sat there, the porch swing moving in a gentle rhythm, Matilda thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment. From fear to safety, from loneliness to connection, from believing herself worthless to knowing beyond doubt that she was indeed priceless to the man beside her and to the family they had created together. It was not the life she had imagined as a young bride, but it was infinitely richer, deeper, and more meaningful than anything she could have envisioned. It was a life built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than expectation, on love freely given and joyfully received. As the stars emerged above their home, Hayes pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Matilda Young," he whispered, the words as heartfelt now as when he'd first spoken them. "And I love you," she replied, content in the knowledge that some treasures like the family they'd built and the love they shared were beyond measure.